Great to be here. We'll talk a little bit about scaling AI in enterprises. And we'll talk a little bit about what we are doing in there, but it's probably a broader topic. And here's where we'll start. I don't know how many of you know what this is. This is if you really think about last 100 years of technology changes, I think along with the light bulb, the Ford Model T, this probably is the IBM System360, which fundamentally has changed how enterprises think about productivity and computing. And it's really interesting, the story behind the IBM System360. Prior to this, when you actually had to go and solve a problem, a compute problem inside the enterprise, you essentially went to a company which had its own hardware stack. They used to write their own drivers, own operating system. Everything was custom. End to end, the whole process was custom. And by the way, if you needed more memory or more capacity, you had to do the whole thing again. Okay? That's how it actually worked till mid-'60s. So basically, there was no way to upgrade. IBM spent probably $5 billion at that point in time. It was an enormous amount of money. And I think they got some fundamental breakthroughs around how to think about modularization. They used commodity hardware at that point, used how you think about modular like a standard operating systems, and then drivers. And all of them were relatively standard. And they also allowed third-party folks, an ecosystem around them to start building that. And what that led to is essentially kind of a take-up in a very dramatic way of IBM System360. And why I'm talking about that in an AI conference. And the reason is, I think that's where enterprise AI is today. If you really kind of step back and kind of not think from a technology perspective, think from a business perspective. And I was at a Financial Times CFO conference 2 days ago in New York, and this was the discussion we were having. And we just did a study around it. Half the CFOs struggle to create a business case with AI. They think it's expensive because the systems are not as nimble. It's difficult, all the training of data, all the talent that they require to kind of go and do that. It's very time-consuming. They don't think it's fast enough to drive value and kind of get to outcomes. And which is really surprising. I mean, and it's coming. Obviously, I'm in a technology conference talking about CFOs, but that's kind of is where things are, is where enterprise AI, what basically people who are paying the bills, what they think about it. And that's not only just one element. So we kind of did some more research and looked at what others are saying. And if you really see research after research, the same thing comes into place. A lot of pilots going on. From like 17 to 18, yes, there's a bunch of whole pilots going up. But are people really adopting it at scale? I think the answer there is actually very checkered. And if you're really honest with ourselves, it's not happening as much. So what do we go from there? What do we do from there in that case? Because if you really think about an AI solution today, there are a couple of approaches. One approach is kind of, you go and get some sort of an AI platform. There are a bunch of them around. And you start building use cases on that. There are advantages to that. I mean, you have a lot better control to it. You get some scale benefits around it. But, I mean, very early in the whole AI journey, you're then locked into a platform. And then the other piece of it is these platforms, I mean, some are probably more suited for marketing use cases. Others probably are more suited for finance use cases. They are not really very general-purpose platforms, to be honest, right now. So it's still evolving. Right? The other example, which is kind of a lot of folks do, and we have done that along the way, a lot of bespoke solutions. Right? You put together a best-of-breed technology. You go and basically create a very customized solution for the particular problem. challenge is the chances of scaling is much harder. Maintaining, if you're able to scale it, is even harder, if you're able to actually even scale that, because you have to then kind of get stuck with it, and you have to kind of keep that fresh, and it's expensive. And if you really think about the problems we are talking about in both the situations, doesn't it sound very similar to what IBM was facing with before System360? It's kind of actually a very, very similar set of problems. So that's what we started thinking about. And our approach, which we have been working for, and this is one example, and I'm sure all of you in your respective organizations probably can think of the same things, is how do we fundamentally modularize AI? And if you modularize AI, it probably makes it a lot easier to go and embed and do interesting things with it. That's kind of how we started approaching the problem. And when we say modularization, what do we actually mean? 3 things. One, how do you bring in, you need some sort of a base platform. You need, and you have basically between Google, AWS, and Azure, they are kind of spending billions of dollars to kind of create those base platforms. You need data. You need a lot of real-world data to kind of go and train again and again. So there has to be some sort of data access that you need to go and have to use it. And pretty much at scale that you can label and do something with it. And 3, you need a ton of domain knowledge. You really need to, and I think that the panel before that, there was just starting technology or domain first. Without domain, nothing moves in our world. And so you have to understand exactly why are you using it, where are you using it, and what are you going to do with it. So that essentially becomes knowledge of your horizontals or your vertical industries at a very great level. So we went through this whole journey and said, okay, when we said about, okay, we have to modularize, we understand we have to modularize, we also understand this is what it means. And then we kind of took it a little bit further. We started thinking about these AI platforms that I just talked about. We said, okay, there are some specific domains that we probably are much better suited for than others. So let's kind of make some bets on those domains and so those industries. And go and organize the data that we have access to through our clients, through our own work over a period of time, and fundamentally try to have a way to mine that. And then I'll go and talk a little bit later about how do we think about putting it all together. So that's kind of so this is our approach. It's an example, as I said, of what we are calling pre-trained AI accelerators. It's our version of modularization of AI to drive value. So how does it work, right? I know yesterday we talked about augmented intelligence. Fundamentally, it's about how do you take machines and humans and blend them together, human judgment and machine intelligence in the appropriate way in a workflow. If you are able to go and do that, you will drive business outcomes. That's basically how we define augmented intelligence. And actually, it fits very well with this pre-trained accelerator approach, because we just have to think about all the 3 things. You have to think about the data layer, you have to think about the prescription engine layer, and you have to think about the workflow and the experience. And if you're able to, you're blending those 3 things together. And for example, what we started doing with the first domain we picked up was in the area of finance. Right? And we said, as a company, we do run a lot of finance and accounting operations for a lot of large Fortune 500 companies. We understand that space very well. We do look at the data a lot in that space, and we know what are the key problems. So essentially what that led to is here's a list of kind of a bunch of accelerators, very point solutions, super point accelerators that we started developing in the finance space. And then we started thinking about, okay, now that we have it, how do you bring it to life? Okay? Here's another example of that. If you think about your accounts payable process, the invoice processing thing, though it sounds fairly simple, it's actually a very, very complex process because of 2 or 3 things. Different types of data that flow in. You receive an invoice, then you have to, someone has to, some are in paper, some are in different EDIs, some are in different formats. So there is some notion of you have to scan it, you have to digitize it in some cases, then someone has to kind of go and do some compliance checks around it. And again, there's some RPA bots that are already in places around that, which will do the manual entry into an SAP system. Then you have to kind of match it to, you have to basically think about the invoice and do the PO check, match it. If it matches, that's fine, you go and pay. If it doesn't match, you basically go and, it's all the human process someone has to do a dispute resolution and exception handling, and then you kind of go and post it. I mean, if you really think about, that's actually what happens when you actually pay an invoice. And what's really interesting is it is highly labor intensive, and not only labor intensive, it has potential to be fraught with errors. And so I told you about how we did the pre-trained accelerators. What we essentially led is kind of what you see the future state in the picture below, where we started replacing elements of that process with pieces of this modularized pieces of AI plug-in. So we started plugging in AI at specific areas. We didn't change the whole process. I mean, because actually you cannot change the whole process. It's still, I mean, to make it a completely 100% automated, we're still some time away. But at some places, for instance, reading of the invoice or doing a decision-making in terms of whether it should go to a dispute or not, there are some areas, because of our pre-trained accelerators, we're able to plug it in. And what you essentially find, if you're able to, once you're able to do that, 50% efficiency improvement, 100% faster time to value, and a significant increase in customer satisfaction. And this is at scale, right? We are not talking about a pilot or a small things on the side that we are testing. This is how invoices are getting processed at scale. Millions of invoices are getting processed like this. This is an example of how you have fundamentally modularized something and embedded in an existing thing and added a lot of value very, very quickly, which we probably would have, if you had not modularized it and not thought about it as a pre-trained accelerator model, it would have had a hard time. Let me give some more examples. Auto claims, right? When you think about auto claims, very frustrating process is you have a fender bender, you bang your car, and what you are going to struggle with is now you have to there's an educator who would come in, he or she will take pictures, go to your claims person, and then they will go and do some calculations and tell you where to take the car and everything. It takes weeks. You're out of a car. Basically, the insurance company is actually at that time paying for your rental. You are unhappy. There's a lot of uncertainty. No one likes that whole claims process anyways. And if you really think about what you can do to better it's the same picture, and we had acquired a company which actually had a Uber version of claims adjuster. So we had a lot of images from cars already in place, around 15 million pictures. And we essentially did the same thing, modularized it, created pre-trained accelerators. And now, if you're able to go and take a picture, we are able to identify the car, identify the part. We partnered with another company which had pricing of the parts and the labor pricing and the parts pricing for the parts, able to match it together, do the classification, but we didn't do one big program. It was like series of accelerators that we built that would smoothen out the entire claims process dramatically. So it's kind of a real-time claims decision engine. Again, there are parts that work much better. For instance, it's much easier to go and the AI is much better to understand if your car is completely totaled or not. Like if it's like a little bit lesser damage, still harder problem to solve for. But the idea is, we know there's a decisioning accelerator, there is a repair versus replace accelerator, and then there's a vehicle parts damage accelerator. And the three of them work together to in the process. And the benefit of this is, let's say tomorrow we have a breakthrough in terms of our accuracy rate in terms of for one of the particular algorithms. It's just a switch. We basically are able to upgrade the algorithms in the process and make it a lot better very, very quickly. Completely different example. Demand planning. In the online world, if this was for a consumer electronics company, and their challenge there was we have been managing the supply chain for a long period of time. And part of managing the demand planning process of the supply chain, and if you understand the last few years of how consumer buying patterns have changed for electronics, it's all Amazon, right? So how do you fundamentally, as a company, manage your demand planning, which is your, your own supply chain, which is in China and Korea and all over the world, Taiwan, where basically your supply chains, your supply side is becoming more distributed and hard, but your demand side is actually a lot more fluctuating, much higher because of how the prices are, right? And prices change, how reviews change. So we looked at that issue, pricing for demand planning. The other aspect of on this thing is promotions, right? All of these, there are a lot of trade promotions that go in between the manufacturer and the retailer, and that has an impact. And when you go and see in any of these bespoke solutions that you go and build, you will very quickly see, yeah, a lot of these, in this case, all the promotion data was PDFs, right? Thousands and thousands of PDFs between the retailer and the manufacturer. It's not digitized. So you have to figure out, again, think about, we had the same accelerator that we built for invoice extraction. You can tweak it, and that goes straight in here. It works pretty well from a PDF, from a promotion perspective also. So we kind of did that. And then the second side of it is there's a lot of web scraping you have to do because Amazon changes prices every 4 hours. Your reviews change dramatically sometimes over a matter of weeks. So how you are extracting the data on a continuous basis, again, those are accelerators involved there who are collecting the data and scraping it and organizing it. And then, yes, of course, then you can plug it into some sort of a promotional forecaster or some sort of a demand forecaster engine to kind of go and get the price sensitivity and then the demand plan of it. Again, if you were to do it as a completely custom, yes, let's say even if it's successful, then you're stuck with maintaining it in a different way. You cannot upgrade it unless completely changing it, unless you have modularized it. Again, an example of how modularization gives a different kind of a benefit altogether. And that just is give an example from a supply chain perspective. That's another big domain area that we focused on. And we went ahead and built a bunch of accelerators in that space so that we can go and do plug and play very, very quickly. Another final example I'll give, if you're in small business lending area, and if you're a global bank in the small business lending, huge challenge around how your underwriters are processing your loans, because the documentation that comes from a loans perspective is very different. It's not as standard. Different countries have different regulations around it. Different standardization of like an income statement in one country doesn't really look like the other country because of different regulations around that. And you have different credit policies around it also. Like different markets will have different credit policies. So how do you, again, kind of a similar idea, right? And then the other difference being, you also don't even control the workflow system. There's very established workflow systems already there. And that's kind of the other advantage. It's not like you have to always create your own workflow. If there is an existing workflow and you're able to go and plug in at the right places, again, you will be able to deploy these kind of solutions much faster. The same idea being, figure out a way to kind of read the data, have the right decisioning tools, have the right AI to kind of go and make the right decision algorithms, and then plug it back into the same workflow that exists. And again, 75 reduction in turnaround time of these credit policy. And again, speed is money in that industry. So I wanted to give you a bunch of ideas around how modularization of AI can fundamentally change business processes and drive value at scale. But if you step back, think about how do you actually go about building one, right? I mean, if you're a practitioner, if you're a company around in that space, how do you think about that? The way we have approached it is essentially thinking about, I mean, apart from the domain data and the core platform itself, we normally try to think of them in 3 buckets, right? Because there's a huge part of AI that is normally used in extraction, cleaning, filtering, normalization, basic transformation. And that set of, I would say, pre-trained accelerators to read more broadly, right? I mean, you can also add images in the same thing. And when you go and think about it, that's a big, big area of where AI can do a lot of heavy lift. And they are in very sometimes mundane processes. A lot of the examples that I gave were not really the cool next-gen sexy things that we normally talk about in AI, but these are the real problems on a day-to-day basis where there is a business case and people struggle with it, right? And it drives value. And just understanding that reading piece of it actually is a big, big leap right up front, and those things are very easily can be calibrated to different problems very, very quickly. Second is around interpretation, right? I mean, on interpretation, you need a little bit more industry domain knowledge, right? Thinking about how a pricing works in consumer electronics good is actually fundamentally very different from how a pricing would work in a drug industry, or how a pricing would work in a financial services industry. So you need to understand the industry domain context around how do you bring in the interpretation that are very, very specific to the industry itself. And if you think about decisioning, that's kind of the third level in our format. There, it's not only just the domain is necessary, you have to have a lot of data because you have to pre-train them. And to be able to do that, like for instance, like running a good forecasting algorithm, yes, even if you understand like in an online world, what a forecasting algorithm would look like, you really don't know which algorithms will outperform others, or which transformations to make or not, unless you have actually tested in a lot of data already in place. Same thing think about invoice reconciliation. You actually have to have the data. That's a lot of IP there, right there, if you're able to go and do decisioning using these pre-trained accelerators. But not necessary, but if you are getting started and if you are thinking about modularization of AI, you don't normally need to have all three of them. I think even if you make progress in one or two of them, there'll be you can make things faster. And then, so if you have a bunch of these things ready, then in terms of how do you actually put it all together, how do you use them? I mean, there's just a couple of examples, right? How you take a bunch of things that, I mean, the first one is an example of the insurance example, which is how do you read the images from the auto to how do you do the interpretation in between, where you have the insurance knowledge models, your automobile part inventory that you would need, because automobile parts are going to be very different. They're very domain specific on their interpretation, and the decisioning, which is like, okay, which is probably a lot more harder, which I talked about with the cognitive total loss thing that we need to go and do. So it's almost think about it as Legos and building blocks that you start putting it together, and you're putting it together in context of some sort of a workflow, whether it's your own or existing workflow, and that's how you kind of bring it together. So there's a bunch of examples that are there. Why this is very important is, as a practitioner community, we need to get this right. Because the consequences, and there was a big examples, there's all the inflated expectations on AI, and AI is becoming, in my mind, a marketing term. It's no longer a technical term. And if you do not manage that, if you don't educate our business counterparts, if you don't go and educate and talk about these, but at the same time find solutions, how to make scalable solutions that have true business value, right? It's very easy to do kind of bash the businesses and saying that they don't understand it, but the reality is there's a lot of like inner thinking we need to do on our side to go and think about how do we actually make these things better. And I think there's a long ways to go for us to kind of come together as a community and think about that question. And this is, as I said, one attempt at it, which we are calling it pre-trained accelerators, which I think moves our thinking a little bit forward. It's not all the way there, but it definitely moves the thinking a little bit forward of how we will solve the scale and the true business value challenges of AI. Let me take you back to IBM System360. After 5 years, and like in the next 15 years subsequent, they made $100 billion of revenue, right? I mean, the most successful, I mean, this thing lasted for 25, 30 years. It's that one architecture, this notion of modularization was so successful. They obviously dramatically expanded market itself. I mean, first they expanded the market, and they had 70% market share. Unheard of, if you really think about it in the world of technology, with that kind of scale. And in some ways, that remains the promise, but I think it requires a lot of things to come together and us to work together towards that. Thank you. Any questions?
Questions? There's one there.
Hi, my name is Pratik. So, yeah, I think this gives a very good view of how to modularize AI, like you said. So, because you're in the services industry, right, and data is so critical for building such models, in your experience, I'm assuming a lot of that data is coming from your clients, and it's kind of proprietary. Well, there is public data also. I just wanted to understand, in your experience, where do you find it harder for getting data to train your models with which you can pre-train your accelerators and give to other clients as well? So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think the whole notion of, and there's a lot of thinking, obviously, that went back into it in terms of client contracts and like the legal aspect of it, but also being very careful about confidentiality. You can do a lot of these things without breaching any of the confidentiality also. But yeah, you have to be very thoughtful about driving access to, like, using the data in the right way. But two things, Pratik, to your question. Number one is, inherent in your question was, service providers have an inherent benefit, an inherent leg up. The answer is, if they can get their act together, absolutely yes, because we do see a lot of data. And especially when you're running a process, you control it a lot better, without a question, and that you control the value chain a lot better. Having said that, can you make progress? Like, there are a couple of the three layers I said: reading, interpreting, and decisioning. Reading and interpreting, I think, will still make a lot of progress with not as much depth of data. Decisioning is where I think you would need somehow have to have a data access. And then I think the point there is, either you like kind of co-develop with clients and do right ways of thinking about contracts around data. Absolutely, that becomes a point. So yeah, I'm not saying it's easy. That's the hard part.
We have a request from CNBC TV 18. Can you please stand up when you're asking a question, because they'd like to cover you also on the camera.
Hi, I'm Arpita from UGAB. So we are a marketing analytics services company. And there's a lot of the type of stuff that you're talking about that we are dealing with as well. And we have to do it at scale, just like you're saying. And we have a lot of clients with very similar problems. We basically deal with the retail industry. My question to you, when I was listening to you describing the way you have modularized it, when I think of how we are trying to do it, we often use the open source codes in Python or R to build the different aspects. So for example, if I were doing a classification problem, I would pick up an algorithm or try out different algorithms. But at the end of the day, if I am working with a client or working for a particular business problem, I have to take that and customize it to the data of that client. Or for example, even reading a PDF. It really depends on the structure of the PDF. You can't just read any PDF with the same thing. So how is what you're saying different from the open source packages that are already there? Because I see those as modules, and then we take each of those and customize it. So, does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense. Two things. Thanks for that question. Number one is absolutely that core baseline that I talked about, the platform, which is kind of whether AWS or any of them, those are the exact open source. The core algorithms are a commodity at this point, right? I mean, you can just call the functions and you can do it. That's not the point. But the art or the hard part is modularizing, understanding there are 15 types of PDFs that come in an invoice or whatever the marketing process you're running. There are only 20 flavors of this PDF documents that will come, right? It's not, if you have seen one or two clients, you will have to always do bespoke. if you have seen 30 clients, you would know that these things only come in like these 15 flavors. And you have to have pre-trained those models to all those 15 flavors. That's the hard part, which is where you need the domain understanding of it, and you need the data to kind of go and do it on an ongoing basis. So the point is, I think, in where, from a maturity perspective, as you go and do more and more of these things, you will start finding patterns that probably don't exist when you do the first 2, 3, 4, 5 things of them. And I think that's the core value in my mind as service providers we can bring.
Just in time, sir. Thank you.
Perfect.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Really appreciated it. I'm available for questions after this.